first.
Here, wait, let me fix my pants.
All right, glad we're recording that.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the EXPN. My name is Matt.
I'm Francis.
And welcome back to another episode / installment / talk around / whatever we want to do kind of episode, where this time we're talking about stories and narratives.
So, Matt, can you actually name a game where you enjoyed it purely because of its story? Not because of the gameplay, not because of all the time you put into it, but just because of the story?
Oh my gosh. There is one game that I actually had in mind that was completely, I played it 100% for the story involved. Didn't really care too much about the gameplay, and that is BioShock Infinite. A lot of people love the gameplay in the game, but I knew that the story was absolutely fantastic, and I had to experience it for myself. The first BioShock I played a lot more for the gameplay, but this one, I just felt like the gameplay segments, I did them, but then I watched the cutscenes more, and I enjoyed it that way.
Yeah, there's definitely a little section of games where it's like, the gameplay is definitely not the focus when you play it. Like, people will just kind of play through the game, like the gameplay sections of it, to get through it, to get to the next bit of story. And that's really a special game right there, because there aren't that many of them.
Oh yeah, stories in games can be absolutely necessary, especially in a lot of titles. The best games out there that you'll see that have the best like critic scores and everything like that are those who balance amazingly interactive gameplay with a great story. And some games can be carried just on story alone. They don't even have to have that gameplay alone.
And it's also something that can separate games in a genre apart from others. Mm-hmm. Like, as far as shooters goes, you look at the old Halo games compared to some Call of Duty or Battlefield titles, and the story of Halo is what separates it from the other games in its genre at that time.
That's true. Fair warning for this episode anyway, as we are talking about narratives in games and stories on themselves, we will be going over a lot of endings to some games, so this is your spoiler warning. If you don't want to watch episode where we talk about games that you haven't played yet but want to play, then this is your warning.
Needless to say, they will be mostly older games, so games like your BioShock 1s, your KOTORs, your Fables, stuff like that.
Yeah, stuff that's from older generations, but still, it's always good to go back and revisit classics, or to pick up new games that are classics that you haven't touched yet.
Just know we won't be talking about games like Far Cry 5 or anything.
No, we're not going over that just yet. I don't even own that game.
Me not.
All right.
Me not.
One thing to separate out, because every game is unique, like we've said, but in the past, what exactly makes a story unique, Francis?
Well, a story can be unique on its own, on many different levels. It can be something that tells a story that's obviously never been told before, and that's both the hardest to do, but the easiest way to be unique if you can pull it off. But there are other ways, like you can take a story, take a fable or a very old, ancient story, and tell it from a new angle. Like, take something like... or retell something as well, because I instantly think of it's a movie example, but I think of Emperor's New Groove and the whole, like, it's really just basing the title off of Emperor's New Clothes and, like, stuff like that, but it's a fun, like, it was clearly inspired by that, in that sense.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. A lot of stories are unique because they focus a lot on different aspects. So, like, one story will focus on this big overarching narrative that focuses less on the characters but more on the world itself.
Right.
And then there will be some that are really specific to characters. I know a game that came out recently that I've heard has a great story, but I'm not going to touch on because I haven't picked it up yet, but I know A Way Out is supposed to be an incredibly good story-driven game that co-op split screen has to be played narrative game. It has a lot less considered to the gameplay, but it's about that story.
Yeah, that's definitely something that you play purely to get through the story of it, and you don't really play it for the gameplay. Though obviously some people still will.
I have heard that it has a lot of similarities to the TV show Prison Break, which is a personal favorite of mine. So I'm excited for that game to pick it up.
Step 1, escape prison. Step 2, profit.
I need a buddy to play that game. There he is.
Coming to a channel near you.
Oh, there you go.
But of course, we know film's narrative. We know that books obviously have stories because that's all they do.
Oh yeah.
And we know that games have narrative. But games, being the medium that they are, they obviously have a thing that make like these different parts of them that make their stories, like the way they tell their stories, unique and very different than any other game.
Yeah, what makes a game narrative different from like a film or a TV show's narrative is because it has to depend on that interactability with the player itself. Mm-hmm. The player as an input in the game itself. Sometimes that could be through choices that they make during the game that affects the outcome, split paths, different stuff like that, or it can just be they're playing different segments and you want to keep them engaged to that story, which you don't necessarily have to do for
of course,
medium.
The one thing we can't forget is games like we'll play a story-based game, even something like a Skyrim, for 40 hours, whereas you think about a movie, you'll sit there for like 2-3 hours. You think about a play, you'll sit through it for like 3 hours at most with intermission. A book can be a certain length, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's like, I feel like games and books have probably the longest, and you could debate it either way as to which one is longer in terms of how much we'll allow.
Oh, yeah.
Which is both a blessing and a curse, because, you got to fill up that time if you really want to spend the whole game just on narrative alone. But at the same time is also... It's interesting, because it's like, you can get deeper in stories. Like, you have your games like World of Warcraft, where you can, like, have this story going on for years and years in a massive role-playing game.
That's true.
And it's great once it gets going, but of course, starting off, it's not as easy because you have to pick somewhere to start from.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of games out there that focus less on the story or have such a little focus on it that they could be made up for with excellent gameplay.
Of course.
But there could also be games out there that have poor gameplay and a poor story, and that's never a good thing.
Yeah, you also have some games, too, even where... Or not even games, but just like game franchises where the story in the game is next to non-existent.
Yeah.
And then you have just all this outside material where it's like, oh, all this story is here.
One game that I can think of that has like a lot of... It has a good story element if they're really focusing on it, but it doesn't take itself seriously, is Doom. Doom doesn't, especially the 2016 version, which had a lot more lore tidbits just scattered around, but it didn't really focus on that. It focused a ton on the gameplay, which was the best part of the game. And
I never even completed that game, and you still got a ton of story in the beginning.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The whole Doomslayer arc with Doom Guy. I thought that was a very interesting take on the whole Doom franchise, which it was never really considered. It's a pretty fantastical story. Creatures of Hell on Mars. Is
what? You mean you haven't just ran into like a random demon creature when you were walking around Mars?
Only when I go home.
I mean, and obviously, like, I played through Doom 3 a lot, and that game is very light on story, just like because you can play through the game without really caring about the story. You can just kind of go through, shoot a bunch of demons, and just win the game.
Oh, yeah.
But there's something interesting that they do that, as a lot of games will do as well to take advantage of as a way to tell narrative. They will use external things, basically not connected to the gameplay itself, to tell their story. In Doom 3, you have these audio logs that you can listen to that will give you little tidbits of story, whereas other games will have like journal pages that you pick up and stuff like that, where if a player chooses to read them, they can then interact with the story that way and find out anything else that they want. And then of course you have your players that just are there to play the game, and they can do that.
Yeah, strikes a great balance between people who want that exploration factor and want to like uncover all the secrets of the world itself, and there are people who are more in it for the gameplay, and then that's the route they can take. They don't have to. Or people who took that route the first time and only did it for the gameplay can go back and replay the game for that story.
It does have those level of replayability to it.
Yeah,
and of course, being a game, there's ways that it can go wrong as well. Like you have those games where they're trying to still tell a story, and then they focus so much on the gameplay that the story just gets lost.
Yeah. What's an example of a game that has taken narrative and gameplay and not found the proper balance, you think?
I'm not sure about finding necessarily a balance, but there are some games where, especially games that have a whole franchise working towards it, but they can basically assume too much or assume that the player coming in will know too much from either previous games or expanded like books, comics, and all that. Like one of the main issues with Halo 5's story was that it assumed that a lot of the people going in will know who Blue Team is, will know a lot more about the Forerunners than was ever said about it in the games. And that led to a situation where a lot of the players who either were playing Halo 5 as their first Halo game or were only playing the games were just kind of like, what is all this stuff that I'm just finding about? And that's why Blue Team was very dull to a lot of people, and Noble Team as well, because they had never been introduced to the characters outside of the game.
Yeah, they were really focusing too much on one specific part of the fan base and not really focusing on that casual audience who had maybe never played a Halo game before and wanted to just pick up this new title.
Exactly. And it's something that you kind of have to balance when you're writing a large franchise. Like WoW obviously has to manage this as well, because it's like, who do you cater to? Do you cater to your returning players? Do you cater to new players? Because obviously you try and balance it, but in the end, one ends up getting a little bit more out of it.
Yep. What do you do about a game that has a lot of its lore based on external sources from the game itself?
Well, you do have to obviously still explain it to players that just haven't read or watched or listened to whatever other material that you have. But one thing you sometimes just have to do is you have to do it again. You have to retell it. You can obviously simplify it and leave out some of the side stories that came out through your books or through your comics.
Oh, one game that I know does almost the exact same thing as Halo 5 does with its lore and providing it as an external source is the game that we've mentioned like 1,000 times by this point, Overwatch. Overwatch has all
What? I've
of
never
its
heard of this
lore.
game. What is that game?
Oh, Blizzard. But anyway, Overwatch's lore is completely explained through outside and external sources like comics and just the lore
And
factors
shorts and all
that
that.
shorts, videos that Blizzard themselves put up in high quality, I must say. And the only lore in game that you can find is through in-game dialogue, which is short and brief and doesn't really reveal too much.
Also, the story events that happen
Yeah,
roughly once a year.
Yeah, those story events. They're
That he is yet to play the second of one.
that's
Second
true.
one of. You get
Hey,
my point.
By the time this video comes out, I will have played it. But anyway, yeah, just external sources can be done right or done wrong because they weren't. Overwatch pushes a lot of their sources out towards the community itself, and Halo didn't really push a ton of its comics, or they didn't really make like shorts or anything.
Well, I think
like
the reason that Overwatch gets away with, I don't want to say gets away with it, but can use that while Halo 5 couldn't, is because Halo 5 and all the Halo games have a campaign that's an integral part of the game to many players. Whereas Overwatch, you don't really have a campaign and you only have those story missions once or twice a year. Whereas, and you basically just play multiplayer the entire time.
Yeah.
So it's like you don't need the story to play the game, but it's still a nice touch for whoever wants to look into it.
Yeah. That's a beautiful transition into the next stuff that I kind of wanted to talk about on this subject, which was campaigns in themselves. A lot of games, you just play it and the story is all that there is. But some games have to balance multiplayer and a campaign mode, especially a lot of recent FPS titles.
Really,
Well,
most FPS titles when you think about it.
Francis, what is your personal favorite campaign in a game that has multiple items like that?
You mean between multiplayer and a campaign in a
Yeah,
genre?
in a game that has a multiplayer and a campaign component, which one do you think balances that the best by having a great campaign while still having a pretty alright multiplayer
I would
element?
probably have to say Halo 2. Although it is not my favorite Halo multiplayer by any means, it would probably be a close call between Halo Reach and Halo 2.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I hate to say it, Halo 3, I wasn't a huge fan of multiplayer. But Halo 2's campaign is arguably the best Halo campaign, while Halo Reach is arguably the best Halo multiplayer.
Not the best ending, though.
Yeah, well, you know. They all had to die.
Fair.
Spoiler. It did.
Hey, we made the spoiler warning.
It's like, but between the two, like, they both had quality campaigns and they both had quality multiplayers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just, it struck the balance where people who were coming for the campaign could have that campaign, and people who were coming for the multiplayer could have good multiplayer.
Mm-hmm.
And the cool thing is with shooters especially, you can use the campaign, if done well, as a way for people playing the game, like who had just picked up the game, whether it's the franchise or just that specific title for the first time, to kind of familiarize themselves with the weapon sandbox and learn how each gun works and just kind of get their reflexes going. Especially if you play on the harder difficulties, you're going to need those reflexes to play in multiplayer, so it's a good practice.
Yeah, that's great. There's a lot of games that they have that good balance between campaign and multiplayer, and they have both those components. But then I feel like there are some games out there that kill that campaign or don't focus nearly as much on it because the multiplayer.
Cough, Call of Duty. Cough, cough.
That don't focus too much on that element because their multiplayer was already too solid, and that's the only thing they focus on in development, or at least it feels like it when you play the game.
Right. I mean, have you ever bought any like shooter, or especially like in my case Call of Duty, and never touched the campaign? Because I know I have.
Call of Duty's been getting better with it, but they've
Well, I
had some
know-
good ones. Modern Warfare
Of
2
course.
had a great campaign.
I
in
know
my
the
opinion.
only Call of Duty game that I've actually purchased, because I did not purchase any of the Modern Warfares, but the only ones I've actually purchased and played through the entire campaign is probably Black Ops 2. And that's just because I had heard about how it runs and how they kind of like have a couple ones that are a little strategic, a little bit like, you know, it's a really cool campaign and just the different ways it plays. And it had multiple endings, so I kind of wanted to try that out. And so it's like, I bought it though to play zombies, and then I eventually was like, I'll check out this campaign mode, why not?
Yeah, I mean, like, they've gotten better, but there are still jarring examples of games that have pretty poor stories to them because they can make it up with a multiplayer component.
Yeah, there are a lot of games sometimes that just feel like one or the other is just kind of tacked on there because it's what all FPS games do.
Yeah, there are some that like really try to have a big overarching story to it, but they either don't present it really well or they there is just some aspects that disconnect it from the player a little bit.
Yeah, and
they're like Skyrim is a beautiful game with a great campaign, but you can kind of get lost in some of the side quests being more interesting than the main campaign itself, you know?
And that is one thing, actually, that I really like about some RPGs, though, where it's like, it does give the player the option, too, on how deep they want to go into the story, how immersed they want to be. Because, you know, I played KOTOR a lot. Shocking, I know.
Knights of the Old Republic, for those of you who don't know the acronym.
Just put a little. But it's like, that game has a lot of side quests in it, and you don't really have to do any of them. There's 1 or 2 story missions that you can just do on each planet, and then you're done. You can leave, and then just complete the game that way. Obviously, you'll be a little underleveled, and you won't have the best items in the world, but that just kind of goes with the territory.
Oh, yeah.
It's like in Pokemon, where you can either battle every trainer and try and use that way to train, or even just grind with wild Pokemon. Or you can just kind of blaze through everything, just fight only the trainers that you have to, fight the gym leaders, fight the Elite Four, do the game as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And even just by doing the side missions, it's not like they're side missions of, go fetch me this thing, although some of them are, obviously, but not nearly all of them. And a lot of them even just give you like this cool little thing where it's like, oh, you find out about this character that you didn't think about, that's related to your story.
That's true. There's definitely a lot of different elements that you can have in terms of characterization in your story. And RPGs do that really well by making you as someone of legend and building in that you affect everything at the same time.
Yeah.
But there are also games out there that have realistic characters too, instead of this big hero of legend, you know?
Yeah.
Zelda reference. Yeah. No.
It is very much a thing that, very much a thing, close enough. It is definitely a thing, though, where, you know, you have these characters that are larger than life, which is fun. It's a little bit of a power fantasy for players, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But it does sometimes make the story a little bit harder to connect to because, well, you're like, okay, I'm saving the world. Why do I care?
Yeah. Well, one of the best things about a story sometimes is being able to follow a character that isn't yourself and watching them develop over the course of a game's narrative. And a lot of games do this extremely well, especially, or they at least establish the character at the beginning with certain archetypes and have them face challenges throughout the course of a game. And I know that one game that does this pretty well is actually a recent title. Wolfenstein has a great cast of characters that are characterized fully and flushed out with their personality traits that make them likable and unique from each other. And that just makes the story even more able to be invested in, creating a great experience, in my opinion, combined with good gameplay.
It is definitely a thing that I've thought about before, where you have these realistic characters and you also have realistic stories. And both are important in a lot of games. And I don't mean realistic stories in the sense that, like, you know, no laser guns, no lightsabers. No, they can still be a realistic story in that to some extent. By realistic story, I mean a story where the progression of events makes sense. It's like, basically, like, say, we'll use Star Wars as an example. You buy in that this world exists. Do the progression of events that follow in this world make sense in themselves?
Yeah. It also helps a story when a character makes a decision that is befitting of what the character would do. Like,
Right.
if a character is established as being egotistical, them making a decision or a choice that inflates themselves is likely, and you can accept that. And then the story progresses more organically, you know?
Right. And I mean, that's not saying that characters can't change or have flaws that either develop or get fixed as the story goes. But if you have a character that you're saying this is the person that only cares about money and they're constantly giving money away to the poor, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in terms of their character.
Yeah.
You won't see Scrooge McDuck working in a soup kitchen every day of the week, basically.
Hey, can we get that soup simulator game?
Kitchen Simulator with Scrooge McDuck. Go, Internet.
Hey, one game that has one of the best characterizations that I've seen is Red Dead Redemption, because John Marston was an incredibly written character, in my opinion, because he comes off as, you know, a former outlaw who's trying to retire, and then the government comes and have him round up his old gang, and that kind of narrative in itself sounds typical, but it paints itself as it goes along, as John Marston realizing kind of the situation that he's been in and how he's grown and how he's developed over time and going away from that gang lifestyle to raise a family. And then, of course, the ending where he gets betrayed by the government and shot and killed. But by that point, he's come to terms with the decisions that he's made and with himself and goes out on a high note. And that's just like a complete arc like that in a video game title like that is very fulfilling for the player.
Yeah, and I mean, it is definitely a certain way where it's like people can get invested in the stories that way. And obviously now you see a lot of RPGs where the investment that players have that make them want to come back and finish the game is just because of the leveling system that they have, where they're like, I want to have every spell or every ability or every weapon, whatever it takes. But a lot of the time it's just something where they're invested in the story and they want to play it through to the end.
Every time I hear about RPGs and story, one title always comes up, and it's Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy always comes up in RPG titles that with a good story. And yes, I know it's a JRPG for those of you out there.
Jerp.
It's a jerp. But anyway, or jerp.
Jerp,
yeah,
good? I don't know.
Final Fantasies 6 and 7 are my favorite, in case you were wondering, because they have... It's the same thing that I was talking about with Dead Redemption.
Dead Red Redemption.
Still can't talk. But after... every character in the game has some sort of arc that they fulfill completely over the course of the game. Some characters die, Eris, but other characters, even the antagonists, have full arcs, and this is true in later titles. I haven't played some of the later titles, but I know the ones for the plots for 6 and 7 fairly well. So those are just the ones I remember.
I mean, a lot of games have those qualities that make you want to go back and play them again. Not just because of the gameplay being fun. Like, you know, generally they can be good stories that you want, goodish stories. They can be good stories that you just want to experience again, or they can be, like, something that you want to explore further. Because I know, like, obviously I know the Harry Potter stories, but when I used to play those old EA Harry Potter games, like the first 3, I would want to go back and be that completionist guy I was, where I try and find every hidden room in that campaign.
Oh yeah, the investment that players put into these stories and just the things that you explored during them are insane sometimes.
Oh yeah,
and I'm guilty of it. I'm guilty of replaying a game like 3 or 4 times just because I like the story.
The inner completionist in all of us.
Oh yeah.
I mean, also, like, the other ways people get around it is by splitting the narrative to do stuff like that, where it's either, obviously, it doesn't have to be multiple endings, like the butterfly effect that you see in some games, but they can also be just stuff where it splits the narrative into certain pathways, where it's like, you know, depending on what you do, this person will live, or this person will live. Depending on what you do, they might go to this place first or the other place first.
Oh yeah, you always hear, like, a lot of people talk about games that when your choices, like, actually matter. Because there are some games that your choices don't actually matter, that ends up with the same ending, but was...
You can choose to run away or you can fight, but you're going to die either way.
Yeah. There are games that actually have choices that affect the ending of the game itself and have that multiple ending aspect. That's like, those are some of the most provoking, because then it feels like the player is part of the game instead of just viewing the story of a game. You know?
And it's cool in a way too sometimes, where sometimes the choices you make will affect how the game plays throughout the entire time even. And I don't mean, like, obviously the controls won't change on you because that would be insane. But like, the situation and the world itself will change. Like, I played Fable 3, and I know a lot of people think that's the worst Fable, but I actually enjoyed it. Shocking. But in the second half of the game, based on what decisions you made and whether or not you choose to follow through on your promises, the world and how the citizens of Albion feel about you can change and is very different. Like, hell, in a couple of the situations, if you make a couple of decisions to, like, based on the environment, like, to follow through on your promises on that, you might have different maps and different, like, even dungeons, I guess, for lack of a better word, be available to you to be able to go into.
Oh yeah. There are games also, too, with morality systems that work out that factor. Like,
Sorry. What?
He likes that game a little.
No, I've never heard of that game at all. What are you talking about?
All right. Yeah, morality systems help out because they sometimes can affect that choice and decision-making that splits the narrative into the way that the player wants. And that way the player experiences the story that would be the most one that they would be in if they were to participate in it themselves. And makes it more immersive, you know?
Well, it's also kind of cool because you have, depending on how many NPCs you have in the party, I'm going to use KOTOR as the example for this because it's the one I'm most familiar with, but in that situation, depending on how Jedi or Sith you are, your party members will interact with you differently. Like, the ones that are evil will like you more. The ones that are good will be a little worried about you. And it's like...
affects dialogue.
It affects dialogue. It affects, like, even in some cases who you even have in your party. And it's just fun that way. Obviously, of course, it affects the ending.
That's true. Speaking of endings, what about twist endings for games?
See, and they aren't even necessarily twist endings. Like, there are twists that can happen all over the place in games. Like, I'd argue that the first KOTOR's biggest twist doesn't come at the end. I mean, it comes. I'd argue about 2/3 through the story, depending on how quickly you play through the ending.
Yeah, that's right. In Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic, it is revealed that you are a Sith Lord, like halfway through.
Well, you aren't a Sith Lord. You used to be a Sith Lord.
You used to be a Sith Lord, but you were brainwashed by the Jedi. But you went through the whole game up to that point thinking that you were like a Jedi good guy. You know,
in my mind, generic. The Jedi are evil.
You went through the whole game up to that point thinking that you were like the standard good guy, and then it turns that on its head. And that can flip a narrative and make it... That game is still talked about to this day, mainly for that reason. Because it had such a great twist.
It's an example of just, like, a twist done well. Because there are the twists that you feel like you've manipulated the story still. Or, like, you've been in control. Because, obviously, you feel like you've been in control because you have been up until that point, and it doesn't even take the control away from you. Mm-hmm. You still have control on every decision that your character makes.
Oh, yeah.
The only thing you lose control of is the past before the game. It's just not what you thought it was. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, there are the twists where they're like, it was a dream! And you're like, well, okay, all I did was worthless.
Yeah. Then there's other twists that are, like, designed to, like, flip you on its head, like what you've been doing for the entire game. Yeah. One game that I can think of like that is Spec Ops: The Line, where it turns out that there is no like big villain. You've just been doing all these military atrocities yourself, and you were doing that. You were making up this figure in your head to like blame. Yeah. The big psychological aspect there that turns all the because then it turns all the gameplay on its head. Because even the stuff you were doing, like shooting other military people, it was like all for. And there was once the phosphorus gas scene where you thought you were gassing an area that already had had all these military people, but it ended up being civilians, and you just killed all these civilians, and that's when the game starts.
I mean, it's kind of like the first Black Ops game. Jesus Christ,
Freudian slip.
Nope. But it is very much like the first Black Ops game, though, where you've played that game's campaign, right?
Yeah.
Where you think that this guy is doing all these atrocities that you're witnessing, when it turns out it was you.
It was you,
and you just remember it differently because, I mean, honestly, it makes sense. He wouldn't want to remember him doing it. He would want to think someone else was.
The classic, it was you the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously twists are hard to pull off well because sometimes they can feel a little cheap and like they cheated the player out of the story that they thought they were controlling. And that's why I don't think twists should ever really be something that's like, oh, you were doing this, but it was actually this. It should be this either happened before the game started or after the game ended.
I love twists that completely like disregard. Like I said before, I'm really into character development over the course of a narrative. I love twists that turn that on its head and completely reverse what you've been thinking. Like you may have been thinking that you're a standard protagonist and your character's been building their character up this entire game to find out the secrets of a world or to save someone or something. Or to do the right thing, and then that just gets flipped on its entire head. It's like, no, you've been doing the wrong thing this entire game. Your entire characterization arc has been nothing but bull. And then I just love that. It completely throws it into the face of what people expect.
It is something that you have to be careful with because sometimes you can get into a situation where you just feel like you did all of that for nothing, and like it just feels like, why did you play this game? Like, it's one thing if it's like the character that is like the lie character, basically, like the one that is completely not what you thought it was, is someone else. But if it's you, that's like, oh, you're actually the bad guy, and all these things that you've done, it was you, or like all these bad things is you. It's weird because it's like, what do you get out of that? It's just basically taking everything that you've done and saying all your decisions meant nothing.
Well, there are some games that might do that. Not the ones that I mentioned,
I
don't think. But there might, I totally agree with you on that. There might be some games that the twist feels forced or like to a degree where it feels like everything that you've done in the past doesn't even matter.
Well, the big thing that it comes down to is really the main focus of games and the main draw that people get from games is interactivity and choice. If your twist makes choices mean nothing, then it shouldn't be as part of a game narrative. It should be part of a film or a book where you have no control on the narrative.
That's true. Twists are much easier to pull off in films and TV shows, I believe, because there's little to no user interaction with them.
Right.
It's not like those. It's not like in literature those choose your own ending adventure books.
Yeah, exactly.
It's different.
if you give the person or whoever is basically absorbing your content or your entertainment the ability to control how the narrative goes, you have to be really careful on how much control you give them and how quickly you take control away from them.
Yeah.
Because it's like, if the character is given enough reason to be like, I should do this, I want to go this path, then it's fine. You can have the story be relatively linear, so long as they feel like that's what they would be doing anyways.
That's true. There are a lot of games that are like linear like that, but then there are some that try and like really push themes, you know?
Yeah.
There are some that like try and make that kind of emotional response. And there have been a lot of games in recent years that have been trying to do that. Maybe because I think games have been evolving into an art form in the past decade a lot.
It's no longer just how many guys can you shoot in 5 minutes? Yeah,
now it's like you can convey this kind of story that expresses like something with society or just a theme. There are a lot of really, really specific games for
the biggest I don't necessarily want to call it innovation, but kind of innovation that's really helped with that is that we've gotten into a better habit of putting story and gameplay intertwined. We're not in the mode that a lot of games used to be, where the gameplay sections are meant for gameplay and then you have your cinematic at the beginning of the mission.
That's true. We are kind of past that stage, and I think that one of the games that does that fairly well is Last of Us. Is one that people talk about a lot that provokes that emotion because it has like this theme of like desperation and heartbreak in it. A lot of people can tell you, especially with some of the scenes with Joel, who's my favorite character in that game just from his character arc.
Well, and I mean, like Last of Us is known for one of the hardest decisions to make in a game with in terms of like Ellie's fate.
That's true.
Because you're like, do you let her die and be like
the cure?
Do you get the cure, or do you save the person that you've felt the connection to now?
Yeah. This other character that's had great development over the course of the game and kind of represents like the hope for the future, more literally and figuratively.
And I mean, KOTOR did this too, where it's like, obviously there's the canon ending and the good ending where everyone is saved and it's a happily ever after, yay. But like there are stuff where there's moments in the game where it's like you can just kill the person that's gone to the dark side, or you can try and save them. It's like obviously it depends on your character's skills. If you have no persuasion, don't even try it. They're not gonna believe it. Just kill them.
Details.
And I mean, there's probably a canon way to use your skill points. All the points for your skills, where you can like tech it so that it works every time. But you still have to work around it.
There's lots of stuff that can like try and convey those themes and try and make the proper choices in making games feel more difficult internally to the player, especially with those big choices, because a game that has like almost an ultimatum choice like that to go one path or a completely different path, that can really stick with a player even after.
I'd argue those are the best decisions to give a player as far as a story decision goes, where neither decision is necessarily the right decision.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about themes and choices and narratives and characterization itself. But what happens when you have a game that has an incredible story in one game, but it does so well that it needs a sequel? It needs a follow-up. How do you make sure, like, especially if you're releasing a game like 5 or 6 years after the release of the first one, which I know is like if a game's in development hell or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, how do you keep players invested in that same narrative that's being told over the course of multiple titles?
Well, obviously you have to connect it to the first one as best as you can. And, in some cases that's easier than others. Like, in cases of trilogies, obviously, and this is true for movies, for books, for games, for everything, really. The first one is usually, like, a clean ending as much as possible, so that way if it has to stand on its own, it can stand on its own. But the second one of a trilogy usually is meant to purposefully set up the third one by its ending. Examples are Halo 2, the Two Towers, and Lord of the Rings. I'm trying to think of other like notable trilogies where it's like the second installment doesn't really have a true ending. It's just like, and now to the next one.
Oh my gosh, there are some. I don't know how about God of War 2 and how it does with that, but I do know that the God of War franchise, it's had its trilogy, and then it's gone on hiatus for the longest time until now, where the new God of War is coming out April 20th. And I'm interested to see what kind of story that they could bring that transitions from a game that's back from whenever God of War 3 came out. Please tell me when, because I can't remember right now. But when God of War 3 to this new God of War, and it looks like they're just changing up the themes so differently,
Well,
and
God
the
of
character
War-
itself.
God of War is an interesting situation where, because it's based in mythology, they can use not just Greek mythology like the first game did.
Yeah.
Like, I think for this one they're using Nordic mythology.
That is true.
So it's like it's interesting to not only have all those different mythologies to pull from for story, but it's also kind of cool to see all these different gods that we never really pictured interacting with each other in the same universe.
From what we've seen so far, it looks like Kratos himself is a completely different character too. That has me so excited.
Well, doesn't he have a son in this one?
Yeah, he has a son, and he's in this father teacher role now. Instead of being this angry,
He is the only
generic,
one.
angry protagonist, he's somebody with a character arc now. And that's got me excited.
Slight tangent almost. That is one of the downfalls with Kratos. Not obviously as a character himself, but also as far as like the game's story as a whole went from the first to the second to the third one, where he went from this guy that was like trying to just get revenge to really just kind of someone that was trying to kill everyone. It kind of like made him lose a lot of sympathy as far as the character goes.
Hey, he got his revenge though. We can't.
He got it in the first one though.
He got it in the first one, but then he got it in the second one, and then in the third one too.
Yeah.
In more spectacular ways. I have a soft spot for all the God of War games. They look great.
Yeah.
I need to play all of them.
And I mean, the biggest problem that sequels often face, though, as far as their story goes, and even this obviously is connected to the gameplay as well, where you can't just fit the themes of the story together. You can't just continue the story. Like, the game has to feel like a part of the series to some way, shape, or form. Obviously, what makes the series, like a game in a series, a game in a series, like what makes a God of War game a God of War game, what makes a Halo game, what makes a Call of Duty game a Call of Duty game is different for each player.
That's true.
Like, what makes a Halo game for me is the multiplayer. What makes a Halo game for someone else could be the campaign.
Yeah. I know that there was a lot of controversy around Halo 4 and Halo 5 Guardians when it came out in terms of keeping that story similar. Because a lot of people consider the original Halo trilogy to be almost untouchable in terms of narrative, because it has a great narrative that spans 3 games that connects to itself.
And I don't think anyone could argue that the original Halo trilogy has a bad narrative.
Yeah, but a lot of people thought that Halo 4 and Halo 5 had a disconnected story from those original 3. It didn't feel the same, and it didn't connect to the same things. Personally, I loved Halo 4's story because I felt like it introduced new elements to the Cortana and Master Chief relationship, and just beyond the rescuing the damsel like it was in Halo 3, which had a great story on itself, but for different reasons. And it kind of expanded upon what already existed, and that I felt was great. And it had great voice acting and animations that were great at the time.
And I mean, the issue obviously becomes where, like, you can't retell the same story again. Like, otherwise people are going to notice. Obviously, some of your fans will be perfectly fine with it or just not catch on if you change the names of stuff just enough. Cough, episode 7, cough. But you still want to you basically want to tell a new story within that universe. You don't want to retell your trilogy. But at the same time, you can't go completely off the rails. You can't jump the shark.
Yeah, you got to keep the same themes, like what made it great in the first place. You gotta keep the spirit of the game.
Your characters have to grow. Your characters can't relearn the stuff they did in the first one, because that would make the first trilogy completely pointless. As far as the narrative is concerned.
I love taking like a time-honored character who hasn't like really done much or had any characterization, and then turning him into some characterized figure.
I mean, that's basically what the Star Wars prequels did. As bad as they were overall as movies, they did that for Obi-Wan.
They did. Nobody can really diss Ewan McGregor's performance in those prequel movies.
That's why I love watching Moulin Rouge, because I can watch Obi-Wan Kenobi sing.
Hey, you gotta watch it for some reason.
Exactly. And I mean, obviously, a problem that not just sequels, but also prequels and like just the games that are connected to each other in movies and books also have this problem, where they can never be as good. They can't be seen really as good things in a vacuum. Because they are always and will always be compared to the other things in their franchise.
Yeah.
Like Halo 2 will always be compared to every other Halo game. Or really, in reality, every other Halo game will be compared to either Halo 2 or Halo 3, depending on what people's favorites are.
Yeah. It's kind of like people who judge the Star Wars movies based on episodes 5 and 6.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not.
Like
it wasn't as
5.
good as Empire.
Yeah, it's really just 5, or it's the whole original trilogy.
It's true.
And I mean, it's something that every franchise runs into. Like the WoW expansions will have people be like, yeah, it's not as good as this one, or it's worse than whatever the worst one was considered to be.
It's kind of like the weakness of their own success, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the more that you have out for something, the more it can be compared to.
If you make a revolutionary title, it's hard to make another revolutionary title that's based on
Another
the
one.
same that's based on the same material as the first one.
Well, of course, because especially if it's an entirely new story, you can't keep telling entirely new stories.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't break the mold twice.
Yep.
Really, at least not easily.
Yeah, that's why one game that actually has been able to do that is I feel like the Uncharted series actually has
Uncharted's pretty good.
Yeah, it's been able to keep good stories game to game and make them feel fresh.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, no game has an inherently bad story the entire time, and no game has an entirely perfect story the entire time, because plot holes exist in everything.
Yeah.
Like, if I could go back and play Halo 2 and be like, that makes no sense. But it's still, like, you know, people will have these things in games, narratives that will either make it for them no matter what else the game does as far as its story is concerned, or one thing that will just break the immersion for them entirely to the point where no matter how good other parts of it will be, they won't care.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of different immersion factors and things that can make sequels just as good as the previous games.
Of course.
Or
prequels as good as the following game?
The final thing I want to touch on before we touch base here is what happens when you try and translate a film into a good game story.
Well, to start, I don't think that's ever really doable. I don't think a film story can be translated, book too, obviously, but we see it done more with film. A film story can be directly translated from film, taking the exact same narrative. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you have more dialogue and whatever to make it work in a game, and put it into a game directly. That I don't think it ever really works.
I think games work better when they're inspired by a film, but aren't direct.
See, what I prefer to see is I prefer to see games where they take whatever universe they're in and they tell a new story. They can take characters that are already established, sure, but because of the inherent fact that games require interactivity, require choices, you can't really have a movie's narrative coming back because people are going to be like, well, we know what's going to happen.
Yeah. One game that I think really did that well was translating X-Men Origins Wolverine into a game. Yeah. The game itself was great because it had all the violent aspects and like the rated M/R content that Wolverine should be known for, like it was in the Logan movie, and they added that to the game, even though they kept some of the ridiculous aspects of the movie, obviously.
Well, of course.
But they made the game a more enjoyable experience than to watch the PG-13 movie with the CGI claws.
And I'm not going to say, like, you know, there are no movie or video games based on movies or even directly copying a movie's narrative that are bad games as a whole. Like, some of them have redeeming qualities, but very rarely are they the entire... very rarely is it the narrative of it and the way it's presented in the game. Like, with the old Harry Potter games, I didn't play it to experience the Harry Potter story in a game form. I did it to play Harry Potter. I did it to play casting spells all over the castle.
That's true. There's definitely like a lot of different things that you can take. Like you can take a spin-off game from the Harry Potter franchise and have it not relate to like the stories from the movies or books at all, and then have it be in the universe. There's definitely a thing to being in the universe.
I mean, it's kind of like Pokemon. You have the stuff that you have this kind of interconnectivity between its games, its anime, and its movies that just it doesn't matter as far as the narrative is concerned because neither really touch each other.
The video game came first,
of course, but
Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow.
Yeah, but it's like you get all these things where the narrative in the anime is not directly representative of what you're going to play in the game, and vice versa. The only thing that's really similar are obviously the Pokemon and the region that they're in.
That's true. There's definitely a lot of stuff that you can take from movies and inspire your game, and there's definitely, you know, the vice versa when games turn into movies, which is
and that train wreck happens.
And that happens.
And the train wreck known as the Warcraft movie comes into life. Sorry, Blizzard, that didn't work.
That's a topic for another time.
Yeah, basically, since we do want to cover film topics as well, we're going to take this opportunity to set up next week to be us covering.
I know what you're thinking. It's been 3 episodes of just gaming, even though our title says gaming, film, and beyond. But that's okay because we have just as much passion for film and the beyond as we do for gaming itself. So do not worry about. Do I look like I use any of those products? No, thank
But
you.
it's like, yeah, basically, especially since there are video games based on movies and movies based on video games, we want to kind of use this opportunity to kind of connect the two. So next week we will be covering movies and their narratives, and especially touching on that topic that shall not be named.
Yeah, game movies.
Assassin's Creed. Anyone?
Assassin's Creed, Mortal Kombat.
World of Warcraft.
Yes. Anyway, but that's basically all that we want to talk about in terms of games and narratives, in my opinion.
Yeah.
We covered a lot. Characterization, immersion.
I'll tell you
A lot
tale.
of interesting topics. Tell us what your favorite story is in a game, because we would love to hear it. There's lots of great games out there that we probably haven't heard about that has a theme that affects somebody personally, you know?
Yeah, and also, of course, tell us if there's or even just try and prove us wrong, that there aren't, of a game that took a TV show or a movie's narrative and made it work.
Yeah, we would love to hear about it.
Yeah.
We might even play it ourselves.
I wouldn't
But
mind trying it.
yeah, fair enough. But anyway, thank you so much for watching yet again. Thanks for putting up with our loud and noisy, but yet good conversation, I would imagine.
I've enjoyed it.
Trying to find a better word than good next time. But anyway,
It was much goodly.
it was much good. Oh, God. Well, then, anyway, this has been EXPN. My name is Matt,
I'm Francis.
and we'll see you next time.
Goodbye.